welcome everybody at this horrible hour. I know it's a horrible hour for most of us at one end of the time scale or the other. And I do particularly thank those participants who are at the extremes of the time spectrum in Hawaii and in Chiang Mai. So welcome to this webinar on Southeast Asia archival collections. My name's Judith Henchy. I'm the head of the Southeast Asia section at the University of Washington Libraries. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction and then we'll start into the program. I can get back to my text here. So in this webinar, we're highlighting the archival collections that will be the focus of a recent Henry Luce Foundation grant to the University of Washington called Tracing Humanitarianism, Linking Southeast Asia and Southeast Asian America Through Archives, Language, and Pedagogy. The grant, which will fund archives fellowships and collaborations with cultural and memory institutions in Southeast Asia, will support work with archival collections as critical resources for the creation of public memory and reconciliation projects. Our partners in Southeast Asia are the Bopana Audiovisual Resource Center in Phnom Penh, the Yangon Film School in Yangon, and the Drug Archive at Ateneo de Manila University in Manila. These are all cultural institutions committed to public education programs that contribute to the historical and political understanding. This webinar will feature speakers who are familiar with the archival collections we are targeting under this grant, and their potential, particularly looking at their potential for sort of didactic and artistic creative uses in outreach and peace and reconciliation programs, both in the Southeast Asia, within Southeast Asia itself and within the Southeast Asian diasporic communities. So I will introduce the speakers as we begin each section. And I have to apologize that the final information for the speakers is now posted to the website that went out on the poster, but some people unfortunately were left off the poster that went out. And also there was a misspelling of Khuensai's name. I apologize for that, Khuensai. So as Michael mentioned, you should be muted most of the time. We are recording and we will open up freely to discussion at the end. And if you do have any questions, perhaps you could put them in chat and Michael and I will try to monitor those. Okay, so we're going to start with the Adrian Cowell collection, which is an extensive audio, visual and textual collection from British documentary filmmaker Adrian Cowell, from his work in Shan State in the 1960s to the 1990s. Our first speaker will be Jonathan Buchanan, who's a postdoctoral fellow at Tallinn University in Estonia. He's a researcher interested in the nexus of opium production, armed conflict, and state formation in Southeast Asia. John was a UW graduate student in political science, and it was his relationship with Adrian Cowell that resulted in the UW receiving this collection of some 800 reels of archival footage from London. And here it is arriving air freight from London. It was really quite an experience getting it to UW. And our second speaker is Khuensai Jaiyen, who's a director of the Pyidaungsu Institute in Chiang Mai. Khuensai was born in Shan State and was involved in the armed resistance from 1969 to 1996. He worked as a full-time journalist from 1996 to 2013, and now he's a full-time peace advocate since 2013. Lindsey Merrison is representing the Yangon Film School. He's a British-born Anglo-Burmese documentary filmmaker and producer and founder of the award-winning Yangon Film School, a non-profit institution that for over 15 years has been dedicated to fostering a diverse media culture in Myanmar. So, John, if you'd like to start us off, please.
Hello, everyone, and I'd like to thank Judith and the University of Washington for the opportunity to tell you a little bit about the Adrian Cowell Film and Research Collection. So Adrian was a documentary filmmaker extraordinaire. And while he is best known for his work on the Amazon, the significance of his work on opium in Shan State is not as well known. So Adrian's work in Shan State spans over 30 years. He first went to the Shan State in 1956 as part of an expedition of students who drove from London to Singapore. While passing through Burma, he stopped in Kangtung for a few weeks, where he engaged in a cricket match with the local police force. In the early 1960s, he returned to Kangtung with cameraman Christopher Mingus for 6 months to shoot a film. And he was embedded with a unit of a Shan resistance organization, whose members included some of the policemen who were his former foes on the cricket pitch. He and Chris returned again in 1972, and this time stayed for 16 months. He traveled with the Shan State Army during this period. And then again, in the early 1990s, Adrian traveled to Ho Mung, which was the headquarters of another Shan armed resistance group, the Mong Thai Army. Okay, so by my count, Adrian has produced 9 documentary films about drugs and opium in Asia. His 2 trilogies, the Opium series and the Heroin War series, are innovative in that they take a holistic approach to looking at drugs. Cowell draws on multiple points of view from people in 3 different locations. So this includes the opium farmers that anchor the opium trade, along with armed groups in the Shan State. He then moves to Hong Kong, where he looks at both drug users, drug dealers, and police. And then finally, he moves on to Washington, D.C., where he takes a look at the tensions between politicians and government officials. So through this approach, he's able to provide an incredibly rare insight into the opium trade. And he develops a powerful critique of the war on drugs and its failures. Okay, so as we can see from the summary, the collection in Seattle is immense and varied. And part of this reflects his method, which involved an extraordinary level of rigorous research. While some documentaries take a month or years, some of Adrian's projects lasted decades. And you can see this reflected in the incredible amount of material that he collected over the years. So I think that while discussing this archival collection, it's important to acknowledge that in Burma today, the military is violently cracking down on civilian protesters. The Cowell archive is important in that it reminds us that state violence is nothing new in Shan State. In fact, it's been going on for close to 70 years. But due to the Civil War and government restrictions, access to Shan State has been extremely limited. And by consequence, we know far more about other areas in Burma than we do about Shan State. Cowell's multi-decade investigation provides one of the few windows into daily life in the Shan State, particularly daily life in a war zone or a conflict zone. His archives contain a vast array of materials. So these include recordings of music, footage of festivals, and interviews not with just leaders of armed groups and drug traffickers, which are rare in themselves, but also with farmers, merchants, shopkeepers, soldiers, monks, and refugees. So in conclusion, we still don't know the full potential of the archive. Not all of the materials have been cataloged, and I'm excited about the prospects that it holds for researchers and what we can learn from it. Thank you.
Lindsey Merrison from the Yangon Film School is the next person on our program. Lindsey, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, so maybe you could talk a little bit about how you see this film footage fitting in with what you do, your work there.
Well, obviously, as a film school focusing on the documentary, we are very excited about the possibility of collaborating with the University of Washington in Seattle. And thank you for approaching us. Yes, archive footage in my own work as a documentary filmmaker. I have Anglo-Burmese heritage, and in my first film, I used footage from the Imperial War Museum in London, which was beautiful, pristine 35mm film, and it was a delight to be able to go through those archives. So I was very excited about this project because it dovetails very nicely in what we we had planned to do certainly this year, which is to launch a series of projects about the peace process in Myanmar, which was languishing somewhat before the coup, and now who knows what is going to happen. But as documentarians, and probably in the same spirit as Cowell, we see our work as an ongoing work in progress. So we would like to think that our students would be able to and be interested in engaging in Cowell's footage in some shape or form. And we do have, I mean, our remit at the school is to train young people from all over Myanmar. So many of you will know that the majority Burma have had a stranglehold on a lot of things, and there has been a kind of Burmanization process going on for many decades, and we want to counter the ignoring of the borderlands and the people who live in the borderlands by training young people from all ethnicities. So we do have a number of Shan filmmakers or Shan or Jaiyen filmmakers. There's a lot of a mixture of different ethnicities. And I would like to think that they would be very interested in engaging with Cowell's work. It is not well known in Myanmar. In fact, I don't know if any of our young students, they are, the current batch are in their early 20s, so I would imagine they're not familiar with Cowell's work. I don't even know if the older students, some of whom are now tutors at the school, they will be in their early 40s, some of them. I'm not even sure if they would know his work, frankly. So they won't have seen the trilogy that went out on British television, Carlton production, the trilogy, The Heroine Wars. So this is all very new territory. The other thing is that we've been trying for many years to get access to the National Film Archive, because the Burmese themselves have been, or the Burmese government, for whatever the other sins they've committed, they've actually recorded a lot of events, official events and activities over the years, and there is some very good 16mm material in the National Film Archive, and I'm very hoping that they will give access to filmmakers and keep this in the public domain, and it won't wander into any private archive anytime soon. But as I say, it's very difficult to say what we can do at the moment, because nobody knows what's going to happen in the country where there is no rule of law at the moment, at the present time. So it's a little bit up in the air, but we would certainly embrace working with the University of Washington on this project.
Thank you.
And I hope that we can send a filmmaker over to Seattle to maybe help with the sifting through these reels. Who knows?
Yeah, well, that is the plan, that we will have an archives fellow who will be helping us look at these materials and working with it from the film school as part of the grant. So I just want to thank you, Lindsey. That was really a fantastic kind of encapsulation of the kind of work that we're trying to do. And when we move on to the Elizabeth Becker collection, you know, we'll hear about some of the sort of artistic work that has been done with that collection. And that's exactly what we're trying to do with this Cowell collection, to sort of bring these materials that are little known into the sort of public discourse within Southeast Asia. And I know that you have mentioned to me the possibility of subtitling some of the Adrian Cowell films, and that would certainly be, you know, a great project, and we'll see how we can fund that. So let's see, is Khuensai there? Is he appearing in the waiting room? Well, that's most strange, isn't it? I wonder if he's having a problem with Zoom. So maybe we should move on, and we could perhaps come back to him and sort of pick up some of the themes that are common throughout the program. So let's hope that it wouldn't be too jolting if we go back to the Cowell collection. So Michael, if you could kind of keep trying, and John, could you try and work to get him connected? Thank you, everybody. So, and we will be taking questions other than what's put in the chat. We will be taking questions at the end. So thank you, everybody. We'll move on to the Elizabeth Becker collection since we have, we're a little short on time. So to introduce the Elizabeth Becker's collection is the materials that photographs and research notes that Elizabeth Becker, who was a, I believe, New York Times journalist at the time, Elizabeth, you'll have to correct me, from her historic visit to Democratic Kampuchea in November of 1978, just weeks or even days before the Vietnamese overthrew the Pol Pot regime. So Elizabeth Becker is an award-winning journalist who began her career reporting during the war in Cambodia and is the author of 3 books on the region. Most recently, You Don't Belong Here, How 3 Women Rewrote the Story of War, which is about women journalists. Our second speaker is Adrian Alarilla, who is a filmmaker, a graduate of the MA program in Southeast Asian Studies here at UW, and a current PhD student in history in the University of Hawaiʻi at Mānoa, studying Filipino migration history. Adrian was the artistic creator of our library's 2017 installation using the Becker materials called Age of the Kampuchea Picture, which won the 2020 Center for Research Libraries Primary Source Award. Our final speaker is Jenna Grant. Jenna is assistant professor in the Anthropology department at the UW and faculty at the Southeast Asia Center. Her work centers on medicine and visuality in Cambodia. So Elizabeth, would you like to start us off with a description of your collection? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Judith. Thank you, University of Washington. I'm in charge of the origin story, which is fun to tell. I'm a 1969 graduate of South Asian Studies at the University of Washington, then Thompson Hall. And I did graduate studies there before going off to Cambodia to become a journalist. Washington Post, not New York Times at that stage.
Sorry. Yeah,
that's okay, it's fine. And just like all of the rest of you involved in Southeast Asia, when I went back to the United States at the end of the war to cover local and national news, I couldn't forget Southeast Asia. So as Judith just said, I went back. I got a rare visa in 1978 to go back to cover Pol Pot's Cambodia. We were the first and last journalists to go there, 2 of us. And I write a whole chapter on this in my book, When the War Was Over, which was published in 1986. And that book is important for the origin story because in it, through research in the Tuol Sleng archives, I discovered and told the story of a woman named Bopana. Hut Bopana. I purposely wanted to put women in the book, which they're often excluded, particularly in those olden days. And Bopana was very special to me because hers was the thickest archive or thickest file. She was tortured and murdered by the Khmer Rouge for the temerity of wanting to live a life of love with her husband, which sort of, to me, was said a lot about the regime. Anyway, fast forward to 2005, I believe. I'm subpoenaed because of my original research, not only then for my book, but also during those 2 weeks. I'm subpoenaed to appear before the Khmer Rouge Genocide Tribunal. And after talking to a lawyer, he said, you won't be upsetting any of the journalistic ethics, particularly concerning the First Amendment, if you put all of your materials in a public domain. And so I said, okay, the public domain will be the University of Washington archives. And Judith already had an amazing reputation. So I knew giving it to the Southeast Asian librarian Judith Henchy, they would be well served. And I not only put all my papers in, I wanted to give them the photographs. So Judith and the library system digitalized it. And then I asked to make an extra copy for the Bopanta Center. Now remember, I just told you about the woman. Well, a young Cambodian filmmaker named Riti Pan asked for permission to do a documentary of her. And I said, of course, she's like my favorite person in the book. And he went on to make it. It was the first documentary in the Khmer language about the Khmer Rouge regime. And he went on to become the famous Riti Pan, whose Oscar-nominated film, The Missing Picture, I hope you all see in some stage. Anyway, so that started not only my collection, not only was in the good hands of Judith, but being generous, the University of Washington shared the entire film, the entire photographs with Bopana. The embassy, the US Embassy in Phnom Penh paid to have it exhibited, so on and so forth, and the relationship began. And now you not only have my archives there, but you have a very grateful Bopana Center working with the University of Washington on all kinds of projects that Jenna Grant will tell you about.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. So Adrian, would you like to tell us about your involvement with the Becker collection?
Sure. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
My slides. Okay, great. So I'm here to talk briefly about the exhibit that we created in conjunction with Riti Pan's visit to UW back in 2017. So in conceptualizing the exhibit, we were thinking about the form, the different forms that the materials came in the Elizabeth Becker collection. So there were facsimiles of government reports, such as these press releases, all of that. And we were thinking about how they serve to sort of create a blank space over Kampuchea on which they could recreate the country in their own vision. So we started with that layer of creating a map of Kampuchea using those documents. And then, of course, there were also those haunting images that Elizabeth Becker took. And what we did with this second layer is we decided to project it. So this was actually the most fun and most frustrating part of the creation of the exhibit, which is sourcing out this filing cabinet at the UW surplus and surplus store, I guess, and then drilling. So Judith and I drilled the holes, both the viewing holes and the vents, so that we could project the images from there. And so we thought it was more important to project the images, not only because these were from the camera of a foreign journalist, an American journalist, trying to take a picture of, take pictures of what Kampuchea was constructed to look like, but also it represented how Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge wanted to project their own image onto the nation as well. And then the third layer is the killing fields. So we placed black spots on the map itself to represent the killing fields, and these also represented the imperfection of the image they were trying to project. So no matter how perfect they wanted to show it, there were always black spots that interrupted these projected images. And the result is something like this. So this is just a quick video clip. We also actually had the audio recording of Elizabeth Becker's interview with Yang Sari, or was it a dinner conversation? You can't see it through this view, but it's there. People could listen to it. And as you could see as well, since the projector is coming from across the room, the images of the passersby are also projected onto the screen. So we were trying to show how, as an American university, as Americans, we are also somehow, part of the story of Kampuchea and the Khmer Rouge. What's interesting is that people not only looked at the screen, but also if you could see, sometimes people would also look at the projector. So like that guy there, and see where that light is coming from. So we thought that was very interesting. Yeah, so that's that. I think that's, I'll stop with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Adrian. So now, Jenna, would you like to tell us your part of the story?
Sure. I'm going to share my screen as well. Can people see it? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Judith. Thank you, everyone who is here at, in some places, are ungodly hours. And I wanted to talk a bit about the Archive Actions Project. This is a photograph with participants in a workshop about the Becker Archive at the Bopana Center in Phnom Penh. This was a small grant from the Whiting Foundation Public Engagement Program that funds academics to do work outside of the university. And some of the questions that motivated this project were how to open the archive to communities affected by the Khmer Rouge, and how to do this in a collaborative way from the very beginning. Some of my assumptions were that archives are a means to produce a new critical history across diaspora. As well, I was interested in ways the university can and should be accountable to its publics. So University of Washington is in a state with the third largest Cambodian population in the United States. And I see part of the work we need to do is to make materials relevant to that community accessible. I worked on this project with an undergraduate student at UW, Amara Tuch, with an artist and journalist in Seattle, Buntai Chiem, and with Sophia Chia, who's an archivist and the director of the Bopana Center right now. You've heard a bit about the Bopana Center. These are just some images from the one of their flyers, but it's an amazing place. If anyone is able to go to Phnom Penh, for those of you who haven't been there, it's a free archive. Students are there. Monks, researchers, you can look at lots of documents from the colonial period to the present. It's also a place that trains young Cambodians in media making, similar to what sounds like the Yangon Film School is doing, and it hosts exhibitions as well. And so part of the workshop there was to look at printouts of materials from the archives, and the participants were artists and archivists and cultural workers, and a lot of photographers actually, but there were also painters, sculptors, and the woman in the upper right in the white t-shirt, Pina So, is just wrote a novel called Bopana. So she's actually also sort of writing this, continuing the story of Bopana and trying to reimagine her as a figure for Cambodian history. After people looked at the archives and discussed questions such as what materials strike you, what do they say to you about history, what questions do they raise about memory, and the different forms of visual representation of this period, people shared their conversations in the small groups, and they were very lively discussions. The workshop in Seattle was a bit different in format. We looked at the original materials and then also printouts of the photographs. This workshop involved students at UW, graduate students in Southeast Asia Studies and in museology, a high school student from Seattle, a cultural worker with the city of Seattle, and a former monk and activists. So there was a mix of people who came to look at the materials and to talk about them. Some of the insights I just wanted to share. We haven't, the project is ongoing, so we don't have a sort of a product or a report or a website yet, but those are in the process. But some of the things that people noticed was how similar the propaganda was across regimes. So in the Democratic Kampuchea period and in the People's Republic of Kampuchea. For example, you see victory, you see some similar communist language about the country, the role of women. And so people noted that across the different materials. In Phnom Penh also, the artists were very attentive to the photographs, to the form, to the framing, and noted how they were, what they described as a performance, right? That they were very curious about this, how the route was planned, how the scenes were staged, what was it that wanted to be shown. There were also questions about the individuals. People were curious, who were these people that interacted with Becker and the others who were with her? What was the relationship between Becker and Suen like? Because there seemed to be some, an interesting relationship there. So they wondered about the individuals as well. And then also sort of reflections on history and what forms it takes. And when Kongolak described this history as a circle, a spiral, a story of different and repeated departures. So we have the departures of people from cities, we have the departure of Lam No from the country, the departure of the Khmer Rouge, and these are all documented in this kind of rich variety of materials that Elizabeth in her archive. In Seattle, people will also back the falsity of representations. And a particular concern was how to use the materials in storytelling, and that storytelling would be a form of reconciliation between elders and youth, but also between Cambodian Americans and Vietnamese Americans. There were quite a few participants who grew up with a lot of struggle and what some called hatred and prejudice between groups. So that, is there a way to tell this story using some of these materials that does some work to bring people into mutual understanding? As I said, this is ongoing, and we would welcome people to come work with this archive. Obviously, at the University of Washington, we're going to be working with the Bopanup Center and the Center for Khmer Studies on a workshop in Phnom Penh. There'll also be a workshop in Manila and in Seattle. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenna. That was fabulous, and I think that there's probably a lot of questions and a lot of further discussion has been initiated there. Do we have Khuensai? Can we go back to?
Oh yes.
Oh.
This is Khuensai.
Oh,
sorry.
Thank you very much for joining us. I'm sorry you had so much trouble.
Sorry, I was used to pushing buttons, and when I push the buttons, it keeps asking me about the passcode, and I couldn't find it.
Oh dear.
Like that.
No. Oh, well, I'm sorry about that.
It's all right now.
Yeah, so I think that this won't be too much of a disconnect, because I know we're trying to pick up kind of common themes on how we use archival collections, and Lindsey was talking about the importance of kind of archives in memory. Perhaps you could give us a little bit of information about your experience in as a Shan, someone in the Resistance Army, and how you see the Adrian Cowell collection as being important. And of course, you knew Adrian.
Certainly. Thank you very much. Sorry for being late. This is my short presentation titled Adrian Cowell's Last Gamble. What I'm going to present is, of course, it may be in conflict with what most people must have heard and read about Khuensai, the drug law. let me assure you that I'm speaking from my own old diaries, which I'm sure don't lie. I had not met Adrian when he was doing the Unknown War in 1964 and 65, and not when he was doing the Opium Warlords in 1972 and 73 with Chris Mangus of the Opium Field fame, of course. Nor have I met him in 1977 when he was accompanying Mr. Joseph Nellis, who was at that time chief counsel to Congressman Mr. Lester Wolf, who was at that time chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. He went to Khuensai to receive his 6-year opium eradication plan. And then he disappeared from us for more than 10 years. After the Chiang's 1973 and 1977 opium proposals were turned down by Washington in favor of the military government's drugs equal rebels rationale. His return in 1993 coincided with the coming to the White House of Mr. Bill Clinton. My diary on 25th November 1993 records what he told Khuensai. President Clinton is a consensus leader, shunning confrontation as best he can. So when it comes to drugs, US State Department just allow people like me to bark and bite the regime. He believes the end of the drug trade will only come when there is an elected government. What Adrian said was in line with Mr. Clinton's speech in Bangkok later. He said that refusal of Burma's rulers to move toward democracy and the regime's involvement in narcotics are really two sides of the same coin, for both represent the absence of the rule of law. When Adrian said that Khuensai's response was, the end of drugs will come only with the departure of the Burmese military forces from Shan State. And to which Adrian replied, I agree. For this, you will need envoys to talk to the president's people. Clinton wants change in the drug policy, but at the same time, he doesn't want problem within the administration either. Therefore, my request is that there be no leakage of my conversation to the media. He probably meant me at the time. Khuensai then asked, what about the 1990 US indictment on me? To which Adrian's reply was, as you know, General, this is all politics. What we need to do is to resolve the political issues first. You won't find the indictment a problem afterward. That was what he said. Just before the end of the meeting, he explained to us that it was not just about the drug issue, that he had to come back to Shan State. While Chris and I were filming the Opium warlords. We were one time traveling with Sertan, one of the SSA Shan State Army's top leaders in the Nampang Valley. There was a festival in the village nearby, and two of his fighters, one was just only 16 and the other was 18. They sneak off to enjoy themselves. Then they were caught by a 400-man Burmese column and interrogated, who asked them about our whereabouts. They even shelled the monastery we were thought to be putting up. And finding no one there, the two were beheaded. We were really moved by these two young men sacrificing their lives for us. And since then, we have vowed to help the Shans in any way we can. The result was the 8-day visit of Mr. Peter Bourne, the former drug czar during the President Carter's administration in April 1994. On 25th April, a 5-point commitment was given by Khuensai. One, the overthrow of the military regime and the establishment of democracy in Burma. Two, the freeing of Aung San Suu Kyi. Three, promotion of peace and security in Southeast Asia. For the ending of opium trade in Shan State. And 5, the withdrawal of Burmese troops from Shan State. His visit was followed by Khuensai's attacks on Burmese strongholds and the march to the north of Burma. Plus,
Khuensai, I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you. I'm going to give you another minute.
I will be finishing
out of time.
now.
Okay, thank you.
Plus my visit to the US. However, an about turn took place after counteroffensive in 1995 by the Burmese military, believed to have been tipped off by China, which dispersed the Shan forces marching to the north and led to a mutiny that shook the whole movement. This was the last straw for Khuensai, who had already lost the drug control of drug to the war, and also Taiwan's covert support for him. And so, surrounded by odds on all sides, he finally decided to surrender, which he did in January 1996. And Adrian, for the third and last time, lost his gamble again. Watching his opium wars and his ending remarks, I always felt that he was trying his best to be objective. But I also felt that his heart was broken at that time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that wonderful story, Khuensai. And it reminds us that this Adrian Cowell collection has insights not only into the minds of these Shan state leaders, but also the American government. And Chris Menge's footage from those committee hearings is just amazing. I mean, you can just see the duplicity, you know, in the faces of the participants in a way that, you know, just reading transcripts you don't get. So
Judith?
thank you for, yes.
It's Elizabeth. I just realized there's a direct connection between my archives and those archives, because Chris Menges, of course, was the cinematographer for The Killing Fields.
Yes, right.
Which was his first Oscar. And he's very well known among the filmmakers of Cambodia and of course the people in the Bopana Center.
Yeah,
I
right.
love it. I love it.
Yes, thank you very much for making that connection. It is, you know, I knew that there were themes here in this presentation that would kind of draw it together coherently, and that's certainly one of them. That's fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on to the Philippines now, with the Philippine collections at the UW Special Collections and the Burke Museum. So our first speaker is, let's see if I can bring up my text here. Our first speaker is Rick Bonas, who's Professor and Chair of American Ethnic Studies at the University of Washington. And our second speaker is Kathy Dougherty, who serves as the collection manager of Oceanic and Asian culture at the Burke Museum. So let's see. Are you ready, Rick? I think you have a PowerPoint to share, is that correct?
Can everyone see it?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Well, it's actually, you know, Kathy and I are presenting together, and we're talking about the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific exhibition, as you said, in the Philippine Archive. Let me see. First, we'd like to acknowledge that we are all in the traditional and land and waters of the indigenous people of the past and the present. In this case, in Seattle, the Duwamish, the Coast Salish, and the Muckleshoot. And so we'd like to bring honor and gratitude to the land, the waters, the air, and the tribes associated with them, both here in Washington and elsewhere. Thank you, Judith, and other organizers for inviting us to present on the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific exhibition in the Philippine Archives. And it's a way of a quick roadmap. We'd like to cover, Kathy and I would like to cover three things in this very short presentation. First, Kathy will talk a little bit about the colonial pathways of the material culture that we dealt with at the University of Washington's Burke Museum in relationship to the 1909 World's Fair. Second, I'm gonna provide everyone with an overview of our online textbook project on Philippine artifacts, as we titled in our online book, Critical Philippinx American Histories and Their Artifacts. And third, we're gonna provide you with a way to cohere the parts of our presentation through a short listing of some takeaways in this collaborative project. So go ahead, Kathy.
Okay, thank you, Rick. Thank you everyone for being here. I'll try to go as quickly as I can. My caffeine is starting to kick in. So, so colonial pathways. How is material culture separated from communities of origin? And in order to talk about the importance of reconnecting community and material culture held by cultural institutions, we need to understand some of the ways that they become separate from each other. The Museum of Us defines a colonial pathway, and I'm paraphrasing here a little, as an inequitable pathway that items of material culture have followed from an origin community to a museum. So this results in a disconnection between people and that material, and not only in a physical separation, but sometimes it can also create other forms of separation, such as spiritual or intellectual. The pathways never favor the origin communities, but rather the colonial institutions. Some of those pathways you can see here. And I want to just mention too that these are not specific to archival collections, but like artifact collections. And an example of an equitable pathway might be an item purchased directly from an artist or an indigenous person, or a gift made to the museum by a member of an origin community. And historically, this just has not been the norm. Okay, Rick, the next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, so the World's Fair as a colonial pathway. In 1909, on the grounds of the University of Washington, which is the figure here on the left, it was mostly undeveloped land at the time. The Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition was held. The theme was development of the Pacific Northwest. The anniversary of the gold rush was just a few years before as well. And the target audience, I would want to note here, of World's Fairs were white middle-class people, not people who are descendant communities or indigenous folks. Those are people who were almost always the subject of the exhibits at the World's Fairs. And you'll see in the photos on the right that there was an Igorot village, which was a major exhibit at the AYP Expo. This was a living exhibit where Igaros performed dances and demonstrations of everyday activities. And these are people who are indigenous cultural groups residing in northern Luzon in the Philippines. It's really unclear which culture was supposed to be represented by this village, but it's most likely an amalgamation of many. And so accurate and equitable representation was really not the goal of this exhibit. The goal was to depict Filipinx communities as exotic or primitive. It was really to appease the curiosity of Americans at this time. The Spanish-American War had just happened about 10 years before, and it was really justification of the Philippine-American War, which ended in 1902, which was just a few years before. Okay, Rick, next slide, please. So how does the World's Fair relate then to the Burke Museum and the ebook project? A large collection of Filipinx material culture, about 300 pieces, was received by the Burke Museum in 1905 from H.B. Hart, who was the exposition manager. It was Hart's job to create exhibits and oversee their construction and maintenance during the fairs. Hart traveled to Luzon and collected material culture directly from the people, but also from marketplaces in Manila. Before the 1909 Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition, Hart collected this material culture in 1905 for the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition, which took place in Portland. And after that exposition, Hart donated the material to the Burke Museum, and they were reused for the AYP exhibit in 1909 for the Igorot village. The collection consists mostly of a variety of materials, but mostly farming and fishing equipment, which you can see on this slide here. And I just want to point out that that basket, the fish trap in the upper right corner, was used in the ebook. So next slide, please, Rick. So the legacy of these colonial pathways persists today. You could see this is a database record, and you might not be able to see the exact information here, but you can see that there's very minimal information recorded for the pieces. And that is not just for this collection, but for thousands of things that we have at the Burke Museum that came through these colonial pathways. And it's really not helpful to community members, particularly those on the diaspora who may have never seen these types of materials in person. It's not helpful for the museum. It's not helpful for the public who may be coming to the museum to learn about these cultures. That's really a disservice to all involved. And the material also becomes, the collection of H.B. Hart, and then centers a white person rather than the origin communities. And it also implies that the cultural knowledge and heritage is a commodity to be owned by a person and to be consumed by the masses. So it's really vital that museums, as Jenna was talking about before, it's really vital that we provide access to collections for communities to engage with, not only to shift the community back to the center of their own story, but reconnecting people with material culture is necessary for bringing meaning back to and giving new life to the collections. Museums really have a responsibility to open collections and facilitate access and engagement, which brings us to the second part of our discussion by Dr. Rick Bonis, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Kathy. Well, our online book project started out as an idea that we hatched in the midst of planning a course on Filipino-American histories and thinking about the ways in which we can bridge ethnic studies with area studies. Discovering some Philippine-sourced artifacts that Kathy was talking about that were mostly in the warehouse in the museum, also with the assistance of Holly Barker, who I think is in this event right now. And then finding a very receptive librarian who facilitated the production of this collaboration through a grant. The intent here was to connect learning just like Jenna's project too, the intent here was to connect learning in the classroom and learning through course texts with learning outside of the boundaries of the classroom by thinking of the museum and the library as spaces outside of our usual learning spaces, and boundaries of the text by performing research and by doing some kind of community interaction. So in doing such a project, we really wanted to rethink, as Kathy said, the role and presence of the archives by encouraging collaboration between, in this case, the Burke staff, the curators, the archaeologists, and the historians with students and the librarians and the scholars and community members, most especially, who were invested in and cared about these objects that may or may not be accessible to them, or thinking about them comparatively and collectively so that we are able to bridge units and fields that usually exist independently or separately from each other. Very similar to Jenna's and Adrian's project with Judith as well. So in this case, especially in the class that I taught, doing this collaborative project also linked area studies with ethnic studies as much as we bridge knowledge sources from on campus and off campus. You see a sample page of our online book here, as well as the front page of our ebook showing the students in the museum, actually, which is just a part of their work. Most of their work happened in the community centers outside of the university. What we accomplished, I think, was having the artifacts come alive with meaning rather than merely existing on a showcase shelf in a museum, making the museum a place of dynamic interaction, as students were all required to interview community members about their relationship to the artifacts. I see a student who's actually present here right now, I think a student or two, with community members and curators and librarians, rather than having the museum simply exist as static display sites. So what we ended up producing was a collective project of knowledge production and interaction in which the emphasis was on process, not product, and on experience and learning versus merely accessing and static memorizing, especially for students. So in this way, the project became a community-based knowledge production project for transforming and making meaning out of or producing public memory that involves the participation of different groups and interests, from those at the museum, those at the libraries, our class, and the outside communities that we dealt with. At the end of the term, I did this twice in two courses. And so in one course, students did a little gathering with some community members and friends to celebrate this practice of collective storytelling. This is a tapa cloth from Pacific Islander cultures. Celebrating some kind of the practice of collective storytelling, if you will, in which the online book was just a part of many that also included many other activities that also included socializing and, in the case here, eating together. So some takeaways. Maybe Kathy, you wanna start with number one?
I do, yes, thank you, Rick. So it's really the responsibility of the institutions with cultural collections of any kind, really, have the responsibility to open collections to community members to facilitate research, access, engagement in new and creative ways. Museums really have to remove ourselves as the center of all stories, as the experts of culture and the only knowledge creators, and make space for others to tell their own stories. Projects like the ebook can shift that center back to the origin communities, where students can be not only the knowledge creators, but the keepers and the sharers as well of their own histories and cultures, and we need to really create collaborative environments through collections use and access.
Yeah, and we also think that artifacts and processes can be springboards and tools for doing many connections of stuff that are usually considered separate or bound tightly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ethnic studies, the campus, the communities outside of it, official memory versus community memory, and so forth. And then last one, that really there are multiple centers in the projects that we do, many voices, many inclusions that you want to encourage, so that knowledge production is always a process and done with critical stances rather than static and unchanging or always ending as finished products. That is our presentation. Thank you, Judith.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, I think we're almost back on time. Yes, that was great. And I would add that as part of the Luce grant, of course, we're continuing this kind of work with a tri-campus class that will also focus on bringing Burke Museum artifacts into the classroom. And that will be led by Raisa Desmet at the Tacoma campus, branch campus. So, okay, so we're going to move on now to Indonesia with Christina. You folks ready? Christina Sunardi is Associate Professor of Ethnomusicology at the University of Washington School of Music and Chair of the University of Washington Department of Dance with a research interest in gamelan music, dance, and gender in Java, Indonesia. And a second speaker is Dimas Ramadan, who is an Indonesian graduate student in the Department of Anthropology, and Dimas has conducted research on the Tristuti Collection, which they are going to describe and talk about. Okay, Christina, you ready to go first?
I am, yeah, and thank you so much for the kind introduction and for inviting me, and also for showing the images that you just had. Would you mind leaving the first image that you had up? I don't have a PowerPoint, and it would be a great reference for people. Yes, that one. Thank you so much. So I thought I would spend my time contextualizing the material in the Tristuti Wayang manuscript collection. For those who don't already know, wayang here refers to wayang kulit, or shadow puppet theater. And this is a great photograph of a wayang performance. You can see the puppets here in the background, and one of the singers who would be part of that performance. Shadow puppet theater is complex and a very rich art form in Indonesia that has different local styles and is accompanied by music. At the center of shadow puppet theater is the dalang, the shadow puppet master. And here is Tristuti in the role of a dalang. So the shadow puppet master or puppeteer, they narrate, they voice all of the characters, they sing, they cue the musical ensemble, and they're very often the troupe leader. Shadow puppet plays can last all night long, and puppet masters are often highly respected members of their communities for their vast cultural knowledge, their stamina, and in many cases, their spiritual power. Ki Tristuti Rahmadi Suryo Saputro was a Javanese shadow puppet master who lived from 1939 to 2009. He was one of more than 1 million Indonesians who were imprisoned following the bloody events of 1965-1966 surrounding the rise to power of Indonesia's second president, Suharto, and the establishment of the authoritarian New Order regime. On the early morning of October 1st, 1965, 6 generals and a lieutenant taken by mistake were kidnapped and murdered by a group of others in the military who identified itself as the September 30th movement. They professed to be protecting then-President Sukarno from a coup. The movement was quickly suppressed by the military under the leadership of Major General Suharto, and the Indonesian Communist Party was blamed for the murders and for masterminding the movement. This led to the systematic kidnapping, imprisonment, intimidation, exile, and murder of hundreds of thousands of communists or suspected communists. It is believed that 500,000 to 1 million people, perhaps more, were killed, although the actual number remains unknown. The violence was particularly brutal in Central Java, East Java, and Bali. Among those with any association or suspected association with communist organizations who were imprisoned, exiled, or killed were performers, including musicians, dancers, and puppeteers. Performers were targeted because some types of theater, including shadow puppet theater, often featured social and political criticism. Also, some performers were associated with communist activity, and some performers and troupes were associated with communist organizations. Ki Tristuti had performed under a cultural organization that was linked to the Indonesian Communist Party and thus was targeted. He was imprisoned from 1965 to 1979, a period of 14 years in various prisons. One of these was the notorious prison on Buru Island, an island in the Molucca island chain in eastern Indonesia, where many political prisoners were held in the 1960s and 1970s, including the famous writer Pramudia Anantotur. During the period of his imprisonment, Ki Tristuti found ways to perform for other prisoners, whether it be stories from shadow puppet repertoire or shadow puppet plays with musical accompaniment using found materials. Following his release from prison in 1979, it would be another 2 decades before he could perform in public without risk. As a former political prisoner, it was illegal for him to perform until after Suharto fell from power. One way that he earned money to make a living was by selling scripts of shadow puppet plays to other puppeteers to perform, often at a fraction of the cost of what the puppeteers earned for performing them, and often without the recognition he felt he deserved. After Suharto fell from power in 1998, Ki Tristuti was able to perform more and finally obtained what was called an artist's license in December 2000, which gave him more freedom to perform. He traveled and performed internationally and thus did enjoy a return to the stage, so to speak, before his passing in 2009. After his passing, the University of Washington historian Lordy Sears, the UW Southeast Asia Center, and others played a key role in the acquisition of the scripts he wrote that are contained in the Tristuti Wayang collection. It is indeed an honor and a privilege for them to live here. I should say it's an honor for the University of Washington. They are a testament to his artistry, his creativity, his influence as an artist, and his spirit to survive through his art. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Dimas, would you like to continue the story?
Yes, thank you so much. I've been doing research on Tristuti manuscript since 2019. So Tristuti manuscripts consist of more than 200 manuscripts. All were typewritten in Japanese language in the combination of Ngoko or Lower Japanese, Kromo, medium High Japanese, and Kromo Inggil, High Japanese, each which are spoken by different characters, showing the complexity of a Japanese daily interaction system. Many of the manuscripts are well dated using a Gregorian dating system, while some of them are in Islamic lunar calendar and also in Japanese chronogram of Chandra Sengkolo. Tristuti manuscripts are generally 20 to 40 pages thick, but there are a couple of them that have more than 50 pages. So many of the manuscripts came anonymously, while some others were named with Ki Suryo Saputro, a name given to him by Sukarno. And also some newer manuscripts, which are probably written after the fall of Suharto, were named with Ki Tristuti Rahmadi Suryo Saputro. So he began to use his full name after the fall of Suharto. I also noticed that some traces of ink eraser leaving some watermarks behind the lines of writing in many of the manuscripts, showing the manuality of the process behind the production. So reading together with Tristuti's manuscript, we can sense that Tristuti was bound into double censorship. The first censorship is from the culture of shadow puppets that leaves a little room for improvisation from the authors. Unlike novels or poems that are often used by other Buru exiles as a media to convey their life stories and critiques, wayang performers and story plots actually are required to follow the existing pattern or pakam that are taught through generation of puppeteers. So here, Tristuti found a very little room to improvise, to at least to make presence in his own manuscript. The second censorship comes from the authoritarian structure of Suharto regime that prohibited Tristuti's public appearance. However, Tristuti was able to find some spaces to improvisation from his anonymity. So this improvisation appears in many tiny details that often go unnoticed and even unknown in the classical literary of wayang tradition. I'll try to share my oh, I think okay. So I think I cannot share my vision. So actually, I present some samples of how Tristuti make his small appearance in his own manuscript. So for example, Tristuti wrote in one of the lines in his wayang that iki dodoku ndidodomu puniko watakipun dipati karno. So this is actually a famous jargon in Indonesia spoken by Sukarno during the confrontation with Malaysia. So this jargon makes appearance in Tristuti's manuscript that was performed by Ki Mantep Sudarsono during Suharto regime in front of Suharto's ministers. So there is like event sponsored by Suharto regime on wayang, but then Mantep Sudarsono used Tristuti's manuscript, and so indirectly he also delivered Tristuti's voice too. Another sample that I use here is about culinary tradition. So during Sukarno's administration, he promoted thousands or hundreds of national culinary recipes from Indonesia that's collected in a book named Mustika Rasa. And Tristuti mentions many times about this some of this culinary tradition in his literature. For example, he explained about some demons that are eating human but spiced with bumbu rujak. So bumbu rujak is the traditional recipe from Mustika Rasa endorsed by Sukarno. So from these samples, actually, it is very apparent that Tristuti leaves hidden message that span from political jargons to Sukarno promoted culinary traditions that are awaiting for further investigation. The presence of Tristuti's message in his manuscript, I suggest, explains the political actualities of his manuscripts. So these are from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dimas. That was really fascinating. You know, I think that we have to do this again and give more time to all of our speakers to, to look in more depth into these collections. So thank you, everybody. So next up, I'm going to talk myself a little bit about the Robert Jones III collection, or the Bob Jones collection, which is a collection that we acquired here in 2013. In a sense, this is the sort of least theorized of the collections, but I want to just throw out some ideas for further, discussion and consideration, because I think there is a lot of interest in this collection. So this is going to be my presentation. I'm head of the Southeast Asia collection, and I hold a PhD from the University of Washington History Department with a focus on 1930s Vietnamese intellectual history. The Bob Jones collection comprises some 4,000 monograph volumes in French, Vietnamese, and English, and several hundred significant journal titles. The materials span from the 1880s to the post-1975 diaspora period. What I'm considering the most valuable core of the collection is the material in French and Vietnamese published in Vietnam and to some extent in Paris from the early 1900s to the 1960s. Much of this material either exists only in France or perhaps in some libraries in Vietnam that we don't know about, or is in a couple of libraries in the US. So we consider them to be rare or endangered. The subjects range from literature to language to culture and to big game hunting, for instance, and nuclear energy and sports and fashion and everything in between. Besides the obvious value of the intellectual content of the materials and what it tells us about Vietnam's long history of cultural adoption and adaptation, the Bob Jones collection provides multiple axes for investigation. As a physical collection that was amassed under extraordinary conditions during the Vietnam War, or the American War as the Vietnamese call it, and an archive reflecting what was available in book markets in Saigon in the later 1960s and early 1970s. In a sense, it reflects cultural values and the economy of knowledge in that period. As a record of intellectual and cultural activity over 60 years of turbulent and contested history, the collection addresses many questions that are under discussion to this day in the Vietnamese American community. And we may ask how these resources can address the continuing strife and distrust among those communities. These historical records speak to, for instance, understandings of communism in the early 1920s, to the factious politics of Saigon in the 1960s, where political alignments were more fluid and subject to negotiation, perhaps offering a model for reconciliation, or at least greater understanding of these questions. This collection is primarily a book collection and not what we would conventionally understand as an archival collection, although it does also include maps, photographs, and unpublished reports and files from Bob Jones' work as an officer in the Cords office in Saigon. While UW is able to house some of the rarest items in its special collections, much of the collection will go to our open shelves and will be catalogued according to the Library of Congress rules. For the purposes of the lens our Luce grant intends to bring to these materials, we have to ask what innovations would help us understand this collection as a knowledge bridge between Vietnam and the Vietnamese diasporas, and between generations whose histories are common, but whose experiences of and in Vietnam are in some ways incommensurable. In other words, to see the collection as a repository of affect that has accrued as these objects themselves has been passed through time, generations, and place. Libraries unfortunately strive towards normativity and have little latitude to accommodate the messy, the dirty, and the smelly. And there's certainly plenty of the smelly in the Bob Jones collection. The smell of the damp Saigon bookshops, the mold of the basement storage, and the long voyage by ship. Yet these are the attributes that speak to the physical history of these knowledge objects. How do we accommodate these affects that are part of the community histories that we're trying to address? And how do we recalibrate the descriptions that we ascribe to these objects in order to make them meaningful to those constituencies? These processes of bibliographic redescription are now under more serious consideration throughout the library world as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement and the intense focus on colonialism's injustices as practiced through the power of description and naming. What would that redescription look like when we consider not only the very necessary work of excluding from our descriptions the derisory and painful languages of colonialism, but to acknowledge that these objects have different meanings to different communities? In the case of war and reconciliation, this means recognizing the validity of personal experience in the contested memoryscapes that these knowledge objects represent, and recognizing the inadequacy of the terminology that we use in cataloging description to encapsulate those histories and memoryscapes. So these are just some of the questions that we hope we can address as we move forward with our Luce grant and the Archives Fellows program. We hope that we will be able to engage those Archives Fellows in kind of theorizing some of these questions. And we look forward to further discussions.
Yep.
So again, I thank everybody for their participation. I think that this was really wonderful, and perhaps we should do it again. And, you know, I wish everybody the best as you continue this fine work. So thank you, everybody.